the man who spoke no name for 10 years, yet set 2 cups each morning, though no one returned. They said he'd lived alone for 10 years, spoke to no one, waited for no one. But each morning he poured 2 cups, one for himself, one for the one who never came. Until one day, 400 warriors rose on the horizon, bearing no guns, only a story no one had yet finished telling, and that place became legend in the Wild West. Up in the Elkhorn Highlands, where late snow still clings in brittle patches, beneath the shadows of worn-out pine, there sits a nameless cabin, leaning slightly north like a man who's braced against the wind too long and now only knows how to stand in silence. Thomas Becket lived in that cabin, a man with a stoop just low enough that folks stopped asking questions, a man who hadn't spoken his name in 3 winters, not out of fear, but because there was no one left close enough to say it right. Each morning he rose when the frost still kissed the door latch. No need for clocks. His bones were tuned to the creak of timber, contracting in air below freezing. He lit the fire, not for warmth, but to count another day he hadn't left. The rust-bit stove in the corner was wiped clean daily with the tail of an old shirt, the one his would-have-been wife used to favor. Now it served only to clear the ash. He kept no calendar, but he always knew when it was Tuesday, because Tuesday was the day he made 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for the person who'd never come. On a pinewood table cracked straight down the center like a dry riverbed, 2 mugs always sat side by side, no more than a hand's width apart. One was plain, thick-rimmed, chipped at the handle. The other, porcelain, faint blue trim, a small fracture at the lip, sent from Kansas, packed in newspaper and straws laced with the scent of dried lavender. June Marlowe, that was the name on the box, a name he'd never met. Thomas had never let his lips touch that cup. He kept it whole the way one leaves an empty chair at a memorial table, not out of superstition, but out of reverence for something unborn, yet worth waiting for. Out on the porch, an old dog named Flint lay curled, hind leg stiff from a bullet wound, the same leg Thomas had mended when he found him at the forest's edge 3 winters back. Each time Thomas brewed coffee, Flint would lift his head slightly, then let it fall again, as if to say, "Not today." The house spoke no words, but it knew the language of creaking embers, the soft clink of spoon against ceramic, and the wind threading through the cracks in the wood. The wind in Elkhorn didn't howl. It whispered, old, slow, circling the eaves like it had stories to remind him of. Stories where those who leave rarely return. Sometimes Thomas stood at the window, hand resting on the porcelain cup, but never lifting it. He wouldn't drink. He'd wipe away the dust, fill it with hot water, and let the rising steam blur the glass. Then stare past it. Beyond were mountains smudged like charcoal, hills half lost beneath a crust of unmelted snow. No people. No word from the world. Only Thomas, and the cup never touched. Spring was near. He knew it from the way the spring behind the ridge began to trickle again, thin rivulets winding their way down the rock, and Flint had started venturing farther, as if maybe, just maybe, someone might stumble upon this forgotten place. Thomas wasn't hoping for a miracle, only that one soul might one day sit down, ask nothing, and let him pour them a cup. On a plain, ordinary morning, as if he hadn't once sent men to die with a single wrong command. And if no one came, then he'd still make 2 cups, one for himself, and one for something he no longer dared name, but still kept sacred like a habit too old, too sacred to break. In the oak chest at the foot of the bed, nestled between hand-scrawled mountain maps and old jerky recipes, lay a bundle of letters tied with twine. The handwriting was rounded, slanted slightly, written on pale cream paper, no perfume, but clean, unsmeared, Sender, June Marlowe. Widow, 41 years old. Corner of 2nd Street, West Kansas. No with love. No longing for you. Just, dear Mr. Beckett at the top, and respectfully June at the end. But between those lines was a kind of gentleness. Unfamiliar, unforced. No embellishment, no declarations. Only the tone of someone sitting just near enough to soothe, without ever touching the wound. The Kansas wind tossed newspapers all down the street today. I thought of the fence you described, the one leaning north from all that wind. Here the breeze only makes the doorbells tinkle. I made barley stew for the neighbor who fell. You once wrote you liked barley in the cold season, so I added salt. Thought maybe you would have done the same. Thomas remembered the first letter from June. It was 1875. After the Fort Laramie Treaty unraveled and news of Apache clashes echoed through the plains, he had sent a sketch of his cabin to a small Kansas paper. No signature, just the return address, Elkhorn. June replied, not asking who he was, only writing, I lost my husband at Washita. I know the cold of a house no one comes back to. The letters never asked for anything. They were like faint sunlight passing through cold glass, just enough to warm the air around his loneliness. He seldom replied. Sometimes he sent a red maple leaf from the forest's edge. Another time he scribbled, the back door's pine now. The wind doesn't howl like it used to. Still, June wrote. Every 2 weeks, no blame, no urging. Once he mailed her a sketch. The porch, 2 chairs, Flint resting his chin on the floorboards. June responded with a porcelain cup wrapped in linen. I don't drink coffee. But if I come, I'd like to see you make it. Keep this cup if you're still pouring in the mornings. That cup now stood on the table, facing him. He never grasped it with both hands, and as if afraid to break something too fragile to forgive. When spring came, her letters grew shorter, but the tone never wavered. When the snow melts, I will come. If you've kept the chair on the porch, I'll sit. Thomas wiped that chair clean each day, brushed dead leaves from its legs. Only Flint knew, and Flint often lay beside it, as if he too was waiting. 3 years ago, Thomas Beckett was not the man who brewed 2 cups of coffee each morning, not a man who knew how to tend a quiet fire or kneel to comfort a limping dog. He had once been a captain, Captain Thomas Beckett, part of a Western frontier regiment, a man with the authority to command gunfire, to draw borders in ink and blood. His last campaign took place in summer, when snow had melted from the passes, but the human heart remained frozen. Intelligence reports claimed a group of Kiowa natives were stockpiling weapons, preparing to raid the frontier's supply depot. The order came at dawn. His unit moved under cover of night, marching through fog-heavy woods, striking just before first light, while the camp still slept. Only there were no weapons, just rough canvas tents, earthen jars, children's handprints in the mud, and the scent of food not yet cold. By the time Thomas understood, it was already done. 18 were dead, 7 of them women, 4 were children, and 1 was Margot, a French Kiowa nurse who once served at the military post and later left to live among the tribe. Margot had once been engaged to him, with a loop of twine tied around her finger in place of a ring. They had made a promise. If the war ever ends, we'll find a place where no one knows our names. That place could still be found, but only one of them was left alive to go there. Thomas was never discharged. The official report stated, action taken under credible intelligence. No one was held responsible. No one stood trial. He simply left. That night, he walked away from the barracks with 3 possessions: a short knife engraved with Margot's name, a brass badge, and an old map marked in red ink, Elkhorn Valley, the place they'd once chosen for their honeymoon. No one tried to stop him. And he never waited for an apology. For more than a year afterward, he wandered, worked at a quarry, watched horses for a caravan, rebuilt a collapsed barn for an old widow. No one asked his name. He didn't offer it until he found an abandoned log house on the far edge of Elkhorn Valley, nearly 20 miles from the nearest road, with no signposts, no well, no path worn by travelers. He fixed the roof, patched the doors, packed the walls with mud so the wind wouldn't slip through at night. Each day he chopped wood, traded with mountain folk for barley meal and salt. No one asked where he'd come from. Only once, when the dog, Flint, was shot during a night hunt, did someone see another side of him. Thomas carried the animal home, pulled the bullet, stitched the wound bare-handed. Since then, they'd lived together, two creatures with nowhere else left to go. Once, sitting by the window, his fingers brushed against the old badge tucked in a hollow coffee tin. The metal was still cold, like the day he'd thrown it into the creek, then stepped in after it too, cowardly to let go completely. Thomas never confessed to anyone, but he never lied either. He simply chose to live a life that asked for no explanations, as if he stayed quiet enough, kind enough, alone enough, guilt might eventually grow ashamed and leave him be. But those things, the ones no one ever spoke of, stayed with him each night. They didn't question. They only watched him light the fire, pour the coffee, wipe the cup clean, and wondered how a man like that had survived 3 winters, with hands that had once done the unforgivable. That morning the sky was murkier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen. It cast only a dull streak of light across the mountains, like someone had wiped dust from a mirror with the back of a hand. Thomas lit the fire earlier than most days. The kettle had boiled. The coffee had steeped just long enough, dark but not bitter. He placed the 2 mugs on the table, as he had each morning for the past 3 years, and pulled his chair to the porch, his gaze steady on the edge of the woods, where the southern trail curled through the trees. Today was the day June had promised to come, not necessarily this day, but a day like today. There was no sound but Flint scuffling near the stove and the occasional crack of settling firewood. No birdsong, no hoofbeats. Only when Flint gave a low growl, ears lifting slightly, did Thomas turn his head. From the edge of the forest a child appeared. He wasn't running. He didn't cry. He moved step by slow step, one arm cradling the other. Blood had soaked through his sleeve, dried into dark, cracked streaks like thirsted earth. A Kiowa boy, no older than 12, barefoot with mud-hardened heels and dust-caked soles. His eyes were wide, not from fear but from exhaustion. Thomas didn't rise. He simply nudged the door open a little farther and waited to see what the boy would do. The child stopped at the first step, didn't climb it, didn't back away. He looked at Thomas, a look that carried no plea for help, but no resistance either, a look that seemed to say, "You know who I am, and I know you don't have to ask." A light wind passed through, lifting the boy's torn shirt, hem to reveal a long gash at his side, bruised, crusted with dried blood. Thomas said nothing. He slid the porcelain cup aside and stepped out. No urgency, no expression. He moved with a quiet surety, his hand hovering just behind the boy's back, not touching, and led him inside as if it wasn't the first time he'd done such a thing. The child said nothing, just followed, his bare feet leaving soft smudges on the damp earth by the porch. Flint didn't bark. He simply lifted his head, watching this stranger cross the threshold that had remained untouched for 3 long years. Thomas seated the boy in the wooden chair across from the stove, the porcelain cup, the one he'd always reserved for June, he filled with coffee and set gently in front of the child. For the first time, that cup was used. The boy took it with both hands. He didn't drink, just held it close, breathing in the steam as if trying to recall a scent from far away. Thomas fetched a clean cloth, knelt down, and slowly peeled back the blood-crusted shirt. No knife, no alcohol, just hot water from the kettle and a torn strip from one of his old sleeves. There was no anger in the boy's eyes, only something quieter than fear, like a bottomless lake hidden behind a wall of black stone. Thomas worked slowly, his hands steady. His eyes never stayed on the child's face too long, as if afraid he might see himself in those eyes if he looked too long. When the bandage was done, he stood, poured more hot water, wiped the spill along the rim of the cup. No words passed between them. The boy sat still, his eyes on the fire, hands clutching the mug, shoulders trembling, whether from cold or something else Thomas couldn't tell. He didn't know where the boy had come from, didn't know who might be looking for him, didn't know what kind of trouble might follow. All he knew was this. That morning a wounded child had sat in the very spot he'd left untouched for 3 years, reserved for someone who never arrived. And even without speaking it aloud, Thomas understood. Sometimes what keeps a man from leaving isn't a promise. It's a pair of eyes that no longer have anywhere else to rest. The fire in the log cabin stove burned steadily through that morning, not because cold was creeping down from the northern ridges, but because Thomas wanted to keep something warm. The Kiowa boy sat by the stove, legs tucked beneath a thick blanket Thomas had pulled from an old wooden chest, a blanket once left behind by a German soldier at a mountain rest post years ago. Thomas didn't comb the boy's hair, didn't take off his torn shirt. He let the child keep every layer as if he understood. Even what's frayed can be armor when there's no one else to shield you. Thomas's hands had once trembled. The day he pulled a bullet from Flint's shoulder using a razor blade and a needle, meant for mending canvas. They no longer trembled. They had learned how to move slow, so no one would flinch. He cleaned the dried blood with warm water, wrapped the wound in fabric torn from the shirt he'd worn the day he received the attack order 3 years ago. That shirt still lay in the chest, buried beneath scraps and rags, like a scar that never healed but couldn't quite be cut away. Now those pieces of cloth became the first thing Thomas had to give, not by command, not by forgiveness, but because someone needed them. The boy didn't ask his name, and Thomas didn't ask where the boy had come from. They simply existed within that small room filled with the scent of coffee, wood ash, and fading blood on worn wooden floorboards. Flint had lain near the door at first, then, gradually, crept closer, until his head touched the bare heel of the boy, now fast asleep on the bench. No growling, only the softest sigh, as if the old dog, too, had finally laid down a burden he'd carried through winter. Thomas took the empty porcelain cup, rinsed it gently with warm water, wiped it dry with clean cloth, and set it back on the shelf, as he always did, not to put it away, but as a quiet ritual, so he could pour again in the morning if someone was still there to drink. He sat down by the window, eyes watching the rain begin to drift thin and silver, like strands of silk unraveling in the air. There was no snow anymore, but the wind hadn't softened yet. The trail to Elkhorn Valley remained empty. No hoofbeats, no voices, no wheel marks in the mud. June hadn't come today. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe never. But he still kept her cup by the stove, and a full kettle near the fire, not because of promises, not because of memory, but because sometimes being there when someone needs you, even just once, is enough to make a man stop thinking about disappearing. Outside, the light dimmed. Tree shadows stirred, casting blurred ink-like stains across the wall. And in that gray dusk, the house remained quiet, but no longer empty. Because now a child slept, wrapped in an old blanket, the wound bandaged, and the cup, once meant for the one who never came, had just been held by someone, with both hands. The next morning, the sky over Elkhorn Valley was as murky as a mirror left unwashed, the light trapped behind thick gray layers of cloud. Thomas rose earlier than usual. A sleep hadn't come. He lit the fire, boiled water in silence, placed the 2 mugs on the table, as he always did. The porcelain cup remained in its old place, for the one who had never arrived. The other, poured first, neither full nor half, was ready for the one who had stayed. The boy was still sleeping. Flint lay under the wooden bench, occasionally twitching a paw, as if dreaming something unsettled. Thomas didn't rush. He sat on the porch, hands cupped around his mug, eyes fixed on the trail, where the snow had melted into scattered patches like salt stains spread across the dirt. Then a flicker of movement across the western sky made him still. Not hoofbeats, no birds, just silhouettes, scattered black specks like dust caught on a cracked telescope lens. He set his cup down, went inside, retrieved the binoculars, the old leather-bound pair he'd once used as a captain. Each turn of the focus wheel clenched tighter around his throat. 1, 2, 10, 20, nearly 400. Not in formation, not charging, just standing, on ridges, on rocks, behind brush, encircling the entire valley. No shouting, no drums, no horses, only the quiet shapes of people dressed in leather, arms at their sides, as if time itself had stopped the moment they stepped to the edge of Elkhorn. Thomas lowered the binoculars, his hands still clenched by reflex. His breath didn't quicken, but something inside his chest began to step backward. 3 years. 3 years without seeing the shape of warriors. 3 years thinking that if he never spoke of the past might let him be. Clearly, he'd been wrong. He didn't go inside. He stood at the edge of the porch, hand gripping the splintered rail, leather worn and soft from years of sun and storm, his gaze reaching outward to where each shadow seemed to look back at him through an invisible scope. They hadn't come to steal, hadn't come to kill, hadn't come to reclaim land or exact revenge. They had come to surround a man, and Thomas knew this time no one would raise a rifle for him, no one would issue an order. All that remained was what he chose to do, and what he had failed to do for the past 3 years. Inside the cabin, the boy was awake. He didn't ask questions, didn't make a sound, just stood behind the doorway, fingers resting lightly on the frame, his black eyes wide, not afraid, but as if he'd always known. The wind began to shift, colder, drier, carrying grit from the hillsides, and a thin whistling sound, like a bowstring kissed by a calloused finger. Thomas didn't call for anyone, didn't lock the door. He simply sat on the porch step, took the old rifle case from its hook behind the door and laid it across his lap, not to fire, only to remind his hands of the weight that had once made others die. Flint sat beside him, breathing slow. The whole valley held its breath. Even the birds that used to perch on the cabin roof had disappeared without a trace. And in that silence, Elkhorn was no longer a place to hide. It had become the one place where past and present could finally look each other in the eye, sit, and not blink. The wind shifted near midday, sweeping hard through Elkhorn Valley, dragging fine dust across the porch steps and the rough wooden walls. Thomas sat on the porch, back against a worn post, eyes on his own hands. The callus on his trigger finger, still there. His ring finger remembered the feel of the twine Margot once tied around it. The night snow fell quiet in 1873, before the last Apache War in Arizona began. The Apache boy sat near the stove. Flint lay between them, eyes half shut, like the lone witness to something about to unfold. A figure broke off from the line of warriors on the ridge and began to descend. No haste, no fear, each step drawn out of memory. Thomas stood without reaching for the rifle. He recognized her, not by her face, but by the way she stood. Margot. A red earth shawl covered half her face. Her braid was dark as midnight. He didn't need her voice. He knew by the way she stood, just as she had the day they parted, before he led his men through Red Cloud Pass, the place Geronimo once turned back federal troops in 1876. Margot pulled down her scarf, revealing the small scar on her cheek, the one he'd once touched near firelight. Her eyes no longer held the color of honey. They looked like wet stone after rain, cold, reflective. She spoke, voice low but clear. I didn't come back to take your life. The wind stopped. Thomas realized mercy is harder than death. Not born of love, but of loss. Margot went on, each word falling like stones into a dry well. I came to see if the man who destroyed me had the courage to save someone else. She nodded toward the boy, now standing in the doorway. Fingers curled around the wooden frame. He's the son of the last man to die in the camp you raided. Thomas didn't ask why she survived, didn't ask how she came leading 400 warriors, but he remembered a letter from June sent the year before. Thomas, if someone comes, don't ask their name. Just ask if they need warm water. June, the woman who'd lost her husband at Washita, yet still wrote to him, had reminded him that kindness needs no reason. Margot stepped closer, just far enough for the cracked earth beneath the porch to touch her boots. No one saved me, but you saved the child. That is enough. She turned. The wind rose, scattering dust that blurred her figure as she returned to the ridgeline. No gunshots, no death. Only a man who had spent 3 years hiding, now standing face to face with the one he thought he would never see again. The forest at the northern rim of Elkhorn Valley was nothing but bare trunks now, no leaves, no birds' nests, as if nature itself had fallen still, holding its breath. The wind had stopped half an hour ago, but no one inside the cabin dared to move. Thomas sat again on the porch step. One hand rested on Flint's head, the other held a mug, long since gone cold. His eyes weren't fixed on the ridge anymore. They stared at the strip of empty ground between himself and the Apache formation, a wall of living silence. Between him and them, there was no line, only a child, small as a snapped twig after rain. The boy stepped outside. No one called to him. No one held him back. The blanket on his shoulders had slipped somewhere along the way, revealing bony shoulders, mud-caked back, and an old scar along his calf, the unmistakable mark of months chained in a camp that treated people like animals. He didn't cry, didn't run, just walked toward the warriors. Thomas stood, his back flared with pain like fire clawing up his spine. His legs were numb from the knees down, but he walked anyway, slow, deliberate. Each step across the dry earth cracked like timber splitting in the dark. He didn't know what he meant to do. Stop the boy? Deliver him to those waiting? He just couldn't let him walk alone. The space between them shrank. The boy turned to look, not afraid, not pleading. His eyes were like Margot's, deep, black, unnervingly calm, as if he'd already died once, and now no one could frighten him again. Thomas reached him, said nothing, placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, not to pull, not to guide, just to place. There they stood, a man and a child, in the heart of the valley. 400 pairs of eyes watched them from the ridges above. No movement, no war cries, no arrows drawn. A warrior stepped forward, young, high cheekboned, holding a spear, not raised, but clenched with intent. He approached slowly, his gaze fixed not on Thomas, but on the boy. "You are the son of Shikoba," he said in Apache just loud enough to carry. The boy nodded. The warrior looked at Thomas. No contempt, no trust, just a question, quiet in the air between them. "Why did you keep him?" Thomas didn't answer with words. He pulled from his breast pocket a weathered scrap of paper, the writing slanted, ink blurred by rain and time. The last letter from June Marlowe. It wasn't long, just this: "If I don't make it, pour an extra cup each morning. Not for me, for whoever might need a porch to stop beneath." Thomas folded it, held it out. The warrior didn't read it, just took it in silence, then gave a slow, firm nod. A small gesture, but it rippled outward like thunder in still air. 400 warriors lowered their weapons. No one cheered. No one wept. But the wind returned, sweeping through the valley, carrying the scent of leather, of old blood, and something else, something like consent. The child did not look back at Thomas. He didn't need to. Before turning to rejoin his people, he placed a hand over his stomach, where Thomas had once soothed him through a fever, and gave a small, silent nod. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a kind of stay, for the man who never believed. He deserved to. Thomas stood there alone. Didn't save anyone, didn't fight, didn't plead. He just walked beside a child, so the child would know he wasn't alone. And sometimes just that is how a legend begins. After the warriors withdrew to the ridgeline, silent, precise, just as they had come, Elkhorn Valley returned to wind and dust. Only Thomas remained, and the space where a child had once stood. Flint still lay on the porch, but did not sleep. The old dog seemed to understand that something had just ended, or begun. He didn't run out, didn't bark, only lifted his head gently when Thomas stepped back onto the porch. Thomas said nothing. He knelt down, quietly brushed the dust from Flint's gray coat. His hands trembled, not from fear, but because something inside him had begun to thaw, like ice cracking after a long winter. Thomas was not used to the feeling of being forgiven. It wasn't as clear as a sentence, not as formal as an apology. It just existed, like sunlight falling across a house gone green with mold after months of shadow. The next morning, the porch still held 2 mugs on the table, one for him and one for whoever might need it. No one came. Still he poured the water, still added brown sugar, still blew gently across the rim before setting it down. The wind carried pine scent from the north, along with a few long black strands of hair caught in his sleeve, perhaps from the Apache child left behind when Thomas held him by the shoulder the night before. And then, just before he turned to go back inside, a figure appeared at the crest of the hill. Not the child, not a warrior, a white woman, thin, head wrapped in a scarf, a leather-bound notebook in her arms. She walked like someone used to being turned away, but who still came. "You're Thomas, aren't you?" she asked, standing 3 steps from the porch. He nodded, said nothing. She lifted the notebook. "I'm Eliza. I gather stories from survivors of the last raid on the Wyoming prison camps." Thomas's hands curled into fists. She went on, her voice neither accusing nor pitying. "A child told me about you at them, said. He never told me his name, never spoke much, but every morning he set a cup down for me. He made coffee like he was waiting on someone." Thomas didn't respond. Eliza opened the notebook to a page, held it out, a child's drawing, uneven and rough. A small cabin, 2 chairs, a man pouring coffee, a dog lying at his feet. "The boy drew it," she said. He said, "If anyone asks who saved me, just show them the drawing." Thomas bowed his head, not because of shame, but because he didn't know how to look straight into the light of such gentleness anymore. Eliza didn't step up onto the porch. She pulled a letter from her pocket, old yellow paper, sealed in ash-gray wax, and placed it on the wooden table. "It's from someone named June. She said it's for whoever's still there." Thomas felt something inside his chest thud once, like an old bell struck in its sleep. Eliza nodded and stepped back. The child said, "You don't need to write back. Just keep the second cup on the table, that's enough." She left, didn't ask for water, didn't press for more. Thomas sat, poured more coffee, opened the letter, not much inside. "Thomas, if I don't make it, stay. Not to wait for me, but so someone else doesn't have to wait anymore." The wind blew backward across the porch, carrying with it the warmth of a brand new dawn. And for the first time in years, Thomas closed his eyes, not from weariness, but because he was holding something that someone else had once lost. After the morning Eliza left, no one spoke again of the warriors or the child, as if even the valley had chosen to keep the secret, just like the man who lived within it. But those who passed through Elkhorn remembered, not in words, but in nameless things. A small footprint by a window no one cleaned, a piece of twine tied around the old dog's neck, a mug set at a tilt, always filled with boiling water, an empty seat at the table no one ever took, rain or shine. That year winter came late. The wind wasn't biting, only dry, like the lips of someone who wanted to say something, then didn't. Flint aged quickly, his back bowed like an old Apache bow, his ears perked only for footsteps Thomas no longer expected. Thomas still lived as before, chopping wood, patching roofs, scrubbing the kettle clean each morning. But now he set out 3 cups instead of 2, one for himself, one for the one who never came, and one for anyone who might pass through, not yet knowing they needed to stay. The valley was never crowded. But after the day the warriors came and went, word began to drift, slowly, of a wooden cabin in the place where no one asks your name, but there's always room for someone with nothing left to give. People started calling him Old Thomas. No one knew his last name. No one needed to, because the story was never about who he was, but what he did when no one was watching. Someone once said, "He never asked where I was from, just asked if I was hungry." Another said, "I saw an empty chair and thought it belonged to someone. Turns out it was there, so I'd know. I wasn't invisible." And then, one day, not a holiday, not a special occasion, a girl with a white horse stopped at the porch. No one knew her name, but they saw her leave a dried sprig of lavender on the door handle and ride away. Thomas didn't open the door. He only sat inside, watching through the curtain as the late sun cut across the room, etching every line around his eyes in light. Elkhorn had a new table now, 4 chairs, not to host a crowd, but to welcome those who had lost their place somewhere else in the world. No headstone was ever carved for Thomas. No one quite remembered when he passed. But those who came after kept the house, still rinsed the cups each morning, still. Oh, he placed 3 mugs, even when no one sat down right away, because they believed you don't need your name spoken to be remembered. If you've once poured water for the thirsty, then the story will keep living in the one place where no one remains to tell it. Nearly a year had passed since anyone last saw Thomas sitting on the porch, when an unusual rain came drifting through Elkhorn. Not heavy, just enough to soften the earth beneath one's boots, to rinse the fine dust off the wooden shingles. But that morning, the keepers of the house found a letter wrapped in leather left on the table beneath a cup of coffee gone cold. No sender, no name addressed. Only a line, inked in faded brown, for the one who knows how to listen. The youngest among them, a girl named Ruth, orphaned in a paper mill fire 7 years prior, opened the letter. The handwriting was coarse, shaky, like that of an old hand, or one chilled from the cold. It contained just 3 short paragraphs, but no one who read it could speak right away. I once waited for someone who never returned. I once held onto a promise I no longer believed in. But then someone else came, not the one I waited for, but the one who needed me to be there. And I understood, not everyone we love will come, but the one who needs us most will find the way, if we choose not to leave. At the bottom there was no signature, only a single muddy fingerprint, tilted slightly left as if leaning toward the heart. Ruth folded the letter and placed it back where she'd found it. No one told her to, but she knew this was not a letter to be kept, but one meant to remain for whoever came next. From then on, the Elkhorn house became known by many names: the House of 3 Cups, the porch waiting for the unarrived, the station without a name where a kind man once sat. But one thing never changed. Each morning, someone would rise earlier than the rest, pour warm water into the second cup, and set the letter back at the center of the table. Not to read, not to explain, just to keep. Because somewhere out there, someone was still wandering, still carrying a scar without a name, still believing they were unworthy of being waited for. And if, one day, they stumbled into Elkhorn, sat down without being asked their name, and lifted a cup still warm, they would understand. Not all loss ends in something terrible. Some losses, if you're patient enough to stay, become the place where someone else begins again. That morning, the fog was heavier than usual, thick and pale, like an old cloth draped across the whole of Elkhorn Valley. You couldn't see more than 10 horse steps ahead. Even the old pine by the porch had vanished into nothing. Ruth was the first to rise. She boiled water, rinsed the mugs, stirred the cold ashes back to life, her hands long accustomed to doing things for no one in particular but doing them still. The kitchen smelled of oak wood and young roast coffee with a pinch of dried anise, the kind her grandmother once taught her to use when the human heart felt heavy. Just as she set the second cup on the table, like every morning, she heard it. 3 knocks, not rushed, not uncertain, as if the person outside already knew there was someone within. Ruth didn't open the door right away. At Elkhorn, no one ever did, not out of fear, but because here people had learned to give others time to be still. The man at the door wore a white hat, worn as if it had crossed 10 seasons of wind. A long coat hung from his shoulders, dusted red, the kind of dust from the southern deserts where people said nothing grows but despair. He stood there, didn't ask to come in, just removed his hat, revealing hair grayed at the temples, and bowed his head slightly. I heard this is where a man doesn't need to say his name. To sit a while. Ruth didn't reply. She simply nodded, stepped aside, and poured hot water into the 3rd cup. The man sat down. Didn't touch the coffee, only looked around, his gaze lingering on each detail, the letter with no signature, the faint carving in the table. Don't leave if you still need to stay. He placed a small folded cloth on the table, inside it a silver ring, from the 1860s, split down the middle by a fine crack. I once promised to bring this to a man named Thomas. Ruth looked up. She didn't ask a thing. She simply placed her hand on the ring, then gently pushed it back toward him. You came late, but he still left you a place. They sat in silence for a long while. The wind began to lift the fog from the ridgeline. The sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the table, and when it touched the old silver ring, it glimmered as if it had never broken. The man said very softly, as if only to himself, I never knew him, but once an Apache child told me, if you want someone to live forever, don't speak their name. Leave a chair empty in their place. And so that morning, for the first time at Elkhorn, there were 4 cups on the table. Yet still one chair remained unoccupied, not saved for someone coming, but left there to remember someone who once sat and chose to stay when he could have walked away. That afternoon, the sun was gentle, not harsh, not glaring. Through a narrow crack in the slats of the Elkhorn cabin wall, a single shaft of angled light slipped in and fell square across an old porcelain cup, its handle chipped. The same cup Thomas had left behind after a winter spent burning with fever. No one had used it since, but no one had thrown it out either. It remained, like a scar, no longer painful, but a reminder that something had once split open. Ruth moved slowly, wiping down each wooden plank, a habit she'd kept from her days as an orphan in the state home. Her fingers passed over shallow notches carved into the door, marks at shoulder height made with knives, left by those who had once come and gone. Among them, a small circle, like a crescent moon, just shy of full. Beside 2 letters, E.M. She sat down, didn't cry, just exhaled, a long breath like wind over wild grass, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of thin cloth. Inside, a yellowing card. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. I will come, when the air is still enough that you won't hear how my footsteps shake. There was no name, but Ruth knew the note wasn't meant for her. It was for someone who had once waited and maybe was still waiting. She took the card behind the house and buried it beneath the dry lavender bush beside the old post where Thomas once tied the aging horse. Flint, not out of superstition, but because where waiting had once lived, the earth remembers promises better than people do. When Ruth came back inside, the man in the white hat was still there. He was seated at the table, drawing a leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket and setting it beside the 4th cup. On the first page he wrote, I have no name to tell, but someone once kept me when I no longer wanted to stay. If you are reading this and feel like you're invisible, then stay, because light never asks you to be the sun to be warm enough for a day still unsure of its direction. Elkhorn had a new notebook now, and from that day forward everyone who passed through left behind a line. No names, no explanations, just fragments. Healed wounds still humming beneath the skin, enough to let the next person know they weren't the only one who'd ever hurt. That morning clouds drifted low across the valley, like strips of fabric draped over the mountain's shoulder. There was no wind. Only a thin haze stretched across the golden grass, laying a light dampness over the wooden roof, like time whispering an overdue apology. Elkhorn woke slower than usual, not from weariness, but because no one had reason to rush anymore. Ruth poured warm water into Thomas's old porcelain kettle. A hairline crack ran from the lip to the belly, but it hadn't broken yet. She placed 2 cups on the table, one large, one small, not asking who would sit with her. Out on the porch, the man in the white hat was sharpening an old blade, not for fighting, but to whittle a new handle for a broken hoe. He worked slowly, as if each stroke of the knife was a way to hold on to something that hadn't completely faded. Beneath the pine column, the Apache boy, now grown, one of the first among the 400 to return, sat carving a name into wood, a name no one ever pronounced right, not so it could be read, but so it would be remembered. Those who stayed behind always have a place in this soil. On the table, the notebook had grown thicker. The entries were never long, just a few lines. I once thought I didn't deserve to walk through this door. My child slept peacefully for the first time in 3 years beneath this roof. If you're reading this, I made it one more day and felt quiet enough to write. No one called Elkhorn a home, No one asked it to be anything more than a porch, a wooden table, and a few mugs that never had lids. But from wanderers, runaways from the dark, to old warriors who came back for reasons no one ever asked, they all knew this place held something, not through words, not through rules, but in the simple fact that the sun keeps rising even if no one promises to watch. Ruth sat by the window. Her hand rested on the open notebook. She didn't write, just smooth the page, like someone brushing a child's hair in a dream. At the bottom, someone had already written a line. Sometimes, what we wait for never comes, but the waiting itself holds us in place, long enough for something else to arrive. Somewhere out in the wide West, someone is still wandering, nameless, directionless. But if they find their way to Elkhorn, they'll see an empty chair, a warm cup of tea, and a faint light falling across a line faded by time. Thomas, still waiting,